This story was sent to me by Sarah Martinez via email. I still get chills thinking about the sound of footsteps following me through those dark woods, knowing that whoever was behind me had been watching me for weeks. But let me back up and tell you how this all started. I was 22 and had just moved to a small town in upstate New York for my first teaching job. The town was surrounded by dense forests, and I loved taking evening walks on the trails to clear my head after long days with my third-grade class. There was this one trail that led to a beautiful overlook where you could see the entire valley spread out below. It became my regular spot, my escape from the stress of being a new teacher. For about 3 weeks, everything was perfect. I'd finish dinner around 6, drive to the trailhead, and spend an hour walking through the peaceful woods. The trail was well maintained and popular with locals, though by the time I usually went, most people had already finished their hikes for the day. I preferred it that way. Just me, the trees, and the sound of my own footsteps on the dirt path. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Thursday evening in late September. I was about halfway to my usual spot when I noticed fresh cigarette butts scattered along the path. That struck me as odd because the trail had always been pristine. The local hiking group took pride in keeping it clean. I picked up a few of the butts and noticed they were still warm. Someone had been smoking here recently, probably within the last hour. As I continued walking, I started noticing other things. Broken branches at eye level, like someone had been pushing through the underbrush instead of staying on the path. Scuff marks in the dirt that didn't match the usual hiking boot patterns I was used to seeing. And then I saw it. A small camp chair folded up and tucked behind a large oak tree, positioned in a way that would give someone a perfect view of the trail. My heart started racing as I realized what this meant. Someone had been watching the trail, watching the hikers who passed by, watching me. I turned around immediately and started walking back toward my car, trying to keep my pace casual even though every instinct was screaming at me to run. That's when I heard them, footsteps behind me that weren't quite matching my rhythm, like someone was trying to follow me while staying just far enough back to remain hidden. My mouth went dry as I realized I was being stalked by someone who had probably been studying my routine for weeks, learning exactly when I came to the trail and which path I always took. The walk back to my car felt like it took forever. Every shadow between the trees could have been hiding someone. Every rustling sound made my pulse spike. I kept my phone in my hand, ready to call 911, but I had no cell service this deep in the woods. I was completely alone with whoever was following me, and they knew these woods far better than I did. When I finally reached the parking area, I was relieved to see another car there, a beat-up sedan with tinted windows that I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it might belong to another hiker, someone who could help me if I was really in danger. But then I noticed the car was positioned so it had a clear view of my usual parking spot, and there was no one else around. This person had been waiting for me. I got in my car as quickly as possible and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I started the engine. As I backed out of the parking space, I saw a figure emerge from the tree line, a tall man in dark clothing carrying what looked like a camera with a long lens. He made no attempt to hide now that I'd seen him. He just stood there watching me leave, and I could swear he was smiling. I drove straight to the police station and reported everything. The officer who took my statement said they'd had similar reports from other young women in town over the past few months. Someone had been photographing female hikers and joggers, following them to learn their routines, and they suspected he was building up to something more serious than just watching. They increased patrols in the area and eventually caught the guy 2 weeks later when he tried to approach another woman on a different trail. Turns out he had been living in a cabin deep in the woods and had detailed files on dozens of local women, including photos of me that he'd taken from his hidden position. The police said if I hadn't trusted my instincts and reported it when I did, things could have ended very differently. I never went back to that trail, and I never walked alone in isolated areas again. Sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones who look just like everyone else, who study you and plan and wait for the perfect moment to strike. I found this on a Reddit thread by user Mountain Hiker 94. The sound of my own breathing echoing off the canyon walls was the only thing keeping me calm as I realized the 3 men blocking the trail ahead of me weren't there by accident. But let me back up and tell you how I ended up in this nightmare situation. My buddy Jake and I had planned this backpacking trip to celebrate finishing our college finals. We'd heard about this incredible trail system in Colorado that led to some of the most remote and beautiful wilderness areas in the state, the kind of place where you could hike for days without seeing another soul. That isolation was exactly what we were looking for. A chance to disconnect completely from the stress of school and just enjoy nature. We'd been hiking for 2 days when Jake started feeling sick. What began as a mild stomachache that first morning had turned into full-blown food poisoning by our second night. He was miserable, couldn't keep anything down, and definitely wasn't in any shape to continue hiking. The smart thing would have been for both of us to turn back, but we were only 1 day away from the main destination we'd been planning to reach for months. Jake insisted I should continue on alone while he stayed at our campsite to recover. We figured I could do the day hike to the summit, take some photos, and be back by evening. He'd rest up and hopefully feel better by the time I returned. I was hesitant to leave him, but he convinced me it would be fine. We were experienced hikers, we had all the right gear, and the weather forecast was perfect. So the next morning, I set out alone with just a day pack, leaving Jake at our campsite about 8 miles back. The trail was more challenging than I'd expected. Steep, rocky sections with narrow ledges and several creek crossings where the path wasn't clearly marked. But the views were incredible, and I was making good time. I felt confident and strong, exactly the kind of adventure I'd been craving. About 4 hours into the hike, I reached a section where the trail followed a narrow canyon with high walls on both sides. There was only one way through, a path that wound along the bottom of the canyon for about half a mile before opening up into a wider valley. As I entered the canyon, I noticed 3 men sitting on rocks near the far end, right where the trail would exit. At first, I didn't think much of it. Other hikers, probably taking a rest break like I'd been doing all morning. But as I got closer, something felt off about the scene. They weren't dressed like hikers, no proper boots or backpacks or any of the gear you'd expect to see on a trail this remote. They were just sitting there in regular clothes, watching me approach with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When I was about 50 yards away, one of them stood up and walked directly onto the trail, blocking my path. The other 2 spread out to either side, effectively cutting off any way around them. My heart started pounding as I realized this wasn't a chance encounter. They were positioned there deliberately, waiting for someone like me, a solo hiker with no way to escape and no one around to help. I pulled out my phone, hoping to call for help, but of course, there was no signal this deep in the wilderness. The men saw me check my phone and started laughing, which made everything so much worse. They knew I was trapped and helpless, and they were enjoying it. That's when I remembered something my dad had taught me about dealing with dangerous situations. Sometimes your best option is to be completely unpredictable. Instead of showing fear or trying to reason with them, I started yelling at the top of my lungs, making as much noise as possible while walking directly towards them with my hiking poles raised like weapons. I shouted things like, "There are rangers right behind me," and "My GPS tracker is being monitored." Anything that might make them think I wasn't as isolated as I appeared. I kept screaming and charging forward like a crazy person, hoping to confuse them long enough to find an opening. The strategy worked better than I could have hoped. The men weren't expecting aggressive resistance from someone who was obviously outnumbered and trapped. They hesitated just long enough for me to push past the guy on the right side of the trail, and I ran harder than I've ever run. I made it back to Jake's campsite in record time and told him everything that had happened. We packed up immediately and hiked out that same day, even though Jake was still feeling terrible. When we reported the incident to the local ranger station, they told us there had been several robberies and assaults in that area over the past year, always targeting solo hikers in remote sections of the trail. The ranger said I was incredibly lucky that my aggressive response had worked because these men had seriously hurt other people who tried to comply with their demands or who attempted to run away. Sometimes, when you're trapped in a dangerous situation with no good options, the craziest choice might be your only chance of survival. This was shared with me on Instagram by Rachel Thompson. I can still feel the cold metal of that knife pressed against my throat when I think about those final moments trapped in that basement, knowing that my captor was upstairs deciding whether I would live or die. But let me back up and tell you how an ordinary Saturday afternoon turned into the worst nightmare of my life. I was 19 and working at a small photography studio in my hometown, mostly doing family portraits and wedding shoots. It was my dream job at the time. I'd always loved photography and thought I was building toward a real career in the field. My boss was this middle-aged guy named David, who seemed professional and legitimate. He had a proper studio space, good equipment, and a steady client base. David had mentioned several times that he also did freelance work for local businesses, things like corporate headshots and promotional materials. So when he asked if I'd be interested in assisting him on a weekend shoot for a new restaurant opening across town, I didn't hesitate to say yes. The extra money would be helpful, and I was eager to gain more experience with commercial photography. The shoot was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at what David said was the restaurant's second location, a place they were renovating before the grand opening. He gave me an address in an older part of town where I'd never been before, and we agreed to meet there at 2 o'clock. I would help him set up the equipment and handle the lighting while he photographed the interior and exterior of the building. When I arrived at the address, I immediately felt uneasy. The building was completely isolated, surrounded by empty lots and abandoned warehouses. There were no signs of restaurant renovation, no construction equipment, no other cars in the area. The place looked like it had been empty for years, with boarded-up windows and weeds growing through cracks in the parking lot. David's car was already there, and I could see him waving at me from near a side entrance to the building. He was carrying what looked like camera equipment, so I figured maybe the restaurant owners were keeping the renovation low-key for some reason. Maybe they were planning to surprise the community with a dramatic transformation. I parked next to his car and walked over to where he was standing. That's when I noticed that the equipment he was carrying wasn't his usual professional cameras. It was a cheap digital camera and some rope and plastic zip ties. My blood went cold as I realized this wasn't a photo shoot at all. David grabbed my arm before I could react, his grip much stronger than I would have expected. He forced me toward the building's entrance while I tried to pull away and started screaming for help. But there was no one around to hear me, just empty buildings and vacant lots stretching in every direction. He dragged me inside the building, which was completely dark except for the light coming through the doorway. The place smelled like mold and decay, and I could see that it had been abandoned for a long time. There was no restaurant equipment, no renovation work, nothing but empty rooms filled with debris and broken glass. David forced me down a staircase into what had once been the basement cellar. He'd obviously been preparing this space for weeks. There were camping chairs, some basic supplies, and heavy chains attached to the concrete walls. This wasn't a spontaneous crime. He'd been planning to bring me here, planning whatever he intended to do to me. He tied my hands and attached me to one of the chains, then stepped back to look at me like a prize he'd won. He started talking about how he'd been watching me at work, studying my schedule, learning my routines. He knew I lived alone, knew I didn't have family in town who would miss me right away. He'd chosen me specifically because he thought no one would come looking. For the next several hours, David went back and forth between trying to convince me that he wasn't going to hurt me and making threats about what would happen if I tried to escape or scream. He kept taking pictures of me with that cheap camera, and I realized he was documenting his crime like some kind of trophy collection. As evening approached, I could hear him moving around upstairs, and I knew I was running out of time. Whatever he was planning to do to me, it was going to happen soon. I had to find a way to escape before he came back down to the basement. The chain he'd used to restrain me was attached to a mounting bracket that had been bolted into the concrete wall, but the bracket itself was old and rusty. I worked at it for what felt like hours, using a piece of broken glass I found on the floor to scrape away at the corroded metal around the bolts. Finally, just as I heard David's footsteps on the stairs above me, the bracket pulled loose from the wall. I was still chained, but now I could move around the basement. When David came down the stairs, I was hiding behind an old furnace near the back of the room. He panicked when he saw the empty chain and started searching the basement frantically. That's when I hit him with a piece of concrete debris as hard as I could. He went down, and I ran for the stairs, dragging the chain behind me. I made it to my car and drove straight to the police station. They found David unconscious in the basement and discovered that he'd been using fake business opportunities to lure young women to that abandoned building for months. I was the first one who'd managed to escape, but they found evidence that he'd killed at least 3 other women using the same method. The detective told me later that if I hadn't figured out how to free myself from that chain, they probably never would have found me. David had picked that location specifically because it was so isolated and because no one ever went there. I survived because I refused to give up hope and because I was willing to fight for my life when it mattered most.